I'm Carrie Clement, and I'm the co-developer of the Ultimate Sweater Machine. The Ultimate Sweater Machine is the fastest and the easiest way to knit that we have ever developed. Before long, you'll be making fabulous projects such as these. There's no end to the things you can make, but there is a beginning. And like anything else that you do for the first time, take it slow and don't expect to make items like these on the first day. These items were made by people who have mastered the Ultimate Sweater Machine. Make warm and cozy Afghans with colorful patterns and make them to fit the size you want, in the colors you choose, and make it at just the price of the yarn. Make sweaters with cables, fair isle, and picture knitting, which is also called intarsia, and make them in a size to fit you, as well as home decorating projects such as throws, table runners, pillows, and so much more. Some of you may be experienced hand knitters, and some of you may never have knitted a stitch before in your life. But regardless as to your level of expertise, take some time to familiarize yourself with the Ultimate Sweater Machine. It's unlike hand knitting, and it's unlike other craft projects you've done. Take an evening without interruptions, without the kids around, and take some time to learn the machine. Before long, you'll be knitting fabulous projects. The pattern book that comes with your machine shows you in detail how to make these basic items. Once you've mastered the basic stitches of the Ultimate Sweater Machine, you will be able to create patterns of your very own. This video will show you how to set up the machine, troubleshoot, and give detailed instructions on how to increase and decrease stitches, cast on, bind off, do ribbing, lace, fair isle, cable, intarsia, or picture knitting. And if you make a mistake or drop a stitch, how to fix it. You'll begin by knitting a practice square 50 stitches wide and 60 rows long, which can ultimately become a baby's hat. In your Ultimate Sweater Machine box, you'll find everything you need to start knitting, including a ball of practice yarn. First, remove the literature pack. Then you'll remove and open the accessory box. This box contains the black plastic hem, the instructional video, the 4 patented key plates, 4 green cards and 1 yellow card, 2 clamps, the needle number indicator strips, a bag containing 3 clips, elastic thread, a nut and bolt, piece of wax, 1 one-prong tool, and 1 one-prong bi-latch tool. And another bag contains the edge tension bands and hooks, used to keep the yarn from curling at the edges as you knit. The patented key plates are the secret of how the Ultimate Sweater Machine works. You'll find 4 numbered key plates to be used for different weights of yarn. A chart of what yarns can be used with which key plates can be found in your instruction book. Take out the first bed half and carriage. Remove the second bed half. And lastly, remove the 4 rod weights at the bottom of the box. Attach your machine to a sturdy, level, and square or rectangle table that has a solid surface and does not have a rounded edge or apron edge. Or you can use a good quality flat board, about a ½ inch thick and at least 8 inches wide, that's attached to a table using C-clamps. It's very important to use the correct table for the sweater machine to work properly. To begin setting up your machine, you will need to put the 2 halves of your sweater machine together. Remove the protective tape just on the inside of the needle bed. Then snap the 2 bed sections together. It will be a snug fit. Turn the beds over. Then on the underside, just use the nut and bolt that comes with your kit to fasten them together. Push the clamps through the hole in the front of the machine, making sure the top of the clamp slides between the bed and the metal rod that joins the bed modules together. Make sure that the clamps are inserted all the way in and pushed back. The front bottom edge of the needle bed should just line up with the edge of the table. Do the same with the other side and tighten the wing nuts under the clamps. Be sure not to tighten so much as to tip the bed forward. This would move the needles by mistake and make it difficult for you to knit properly. Remove the protective tape on the top of the needle bed. Remove one of the number strips and attach it to the needle bed just in front of the green retainer bars, starting with the unshaded section of the strip. Now attach the second strip, but be sure the section that's in the center starts with the shaded section. The number strips are very adhesive, so be sure they don't stick on the wrong place. There are 4 needle positions. Holding position, the yarn is held over the needles when you knit a row. Forward working position, used for casting on and some fancy stitches. Working position, normal knitting position. And non-working position, the needles do not work when they're here. Using the green cards, push the needles you want to use in the holding position. There should be an equal number of needles on each side of the center. Place the green cards behind the needles to keep them from moving back. The needles that now have the green cards behind them are in what's called holding position. We will learn more about needle position shortly. Insert the 4 rod weights into the hem, overlapping them in the center. You will be placing 2 rods on each side of the hem. Pick up the weighted hem and find the center, which is marked with a small hole. Hold the hem so the center hole matches up with the center needle bed where you join the 2 halves. Now line up the hem so that 1 plastic strip goes in each space between the needles. Check to be sure there's only 1 hem strip between each needle. Lay the top of the hem on the needle bed and make sure the latches are open that you want to cast on. Here is a closer look at the latches and how they look when they're open. You don't have to open them individually. The transfer tool makes it easy to open them. Now, cut a piece of elastic thread and lay it into the open hooks. Attach a small clip to each end of the elastic thread to hold it in place. Fold the hem evenly over the elastic thread, making sure the plastic strips are between the needles and not resting on any of them. Then push the hem all the way back against the needle bed. Put the carriage on the needle bed, making sure it's hooked over the back rail. This is important. Lift up the carriage handle and insert the number 3 key plate with the number facing up. Make sure it slips under the 2 side shelves in the back of the carriage. The key plates easily fit into the carriage and are used to determine the size of the stitch knitted that is best suited for the yarn you've chosen. If you want to change the size of your stitch or the type of yarn you're using, simply change the key plate. Remember, for some of you, this is going to come very easily, but for many others of you, it will take a little bit more time of trial and error and practicing. But stick with us, and we're going to be going over some very important points for knitting in the next section. We're about ready to begin the first row, so we'll need to get the needles in the forward working position. Remove the green cards and replace them with the yellow one. Now, using one of the green cards, push the needles back against the yellow card, moving the yellow card as you go along, until all the needles are in the forward working position. Check to make sure that all of the needle latches are open. Take the ball of yarn that came with your machine, pull out several lengths, and place the ball behind the machine. Thread the carriage by bringing the yarn forward through the slot in the handle. Then bring the yarn through the eye of the carriage. For the practice square project, make sure you have approximately 1 yard of extra yarn hanging down. And we're ready to go. Line up the carriage with the first working needle, making sure the green stripper plates under the front of the carriage run underneath the needles. Hold the yarn with one hand until the first needle catches the yarn, and then with both hands firmly on the handle, push the carriage slowly and steadily across. Congratulations! You have just knitted your first 50 stitches in a matter of seconds. In order to keep the loose end of yarn out of the way, move it behind the hem and attach a clip to it for weight. Before you begin the next row, it's important that you hold a loop of slack yarn. The yarn must run through the yarn guide in the nose of the carriage, or your stitches can drop. Be sure to push the carriage until the last needle stops moving. Then push the carriage until it's just over the first working needle, let go of the yarn, and continue to knit. That's all there is to it. You're on your way to making loads of beautiful knitted projects. Remember when you learned how to ride a bike or how to use the computer? Ultimately, it wasn't difficult at all, but you did have to go through a learning process. The ultimate sweater machine can also have its challenges, but in the next section, we're going to show you how to fix some of those problems you might run into. Make sure your ultimate sweater machine is set up on a flat surface with a true bottom, similar to a piece of hardwood board. Also, make sure you have not screwed the clamps on so tightly that they raise the back of the bed. Check this first if you have any trouble knitting. When you knit your first row, make sure the latches are open or you'll drop a stitch. After you knit the first row, you don't need to worry about the latches when they're in working position. If the carriage jams, it usually means there is a needle out of line. Your needles need to stay in the working or forward working positions. They don't have to be in perfect alignment, but they can't be in between positions. If the carriage jams at the beginning of the row, be sure the green stripper plates on the underside of the carriage run just below the needles. The green stripper plate is supposed to slightly raise the needles as the ultimate sweater machine knits. If the carriage jams after a few stitches, check to be sure the yarn hasn't wrapped around one of the stripper plates on the underside of the carriage. Release the yarn from around the plate, pull up the yarn, and continue to knit the row. To prevent this from happening in the future, be sure to hold the yarn at the beginning of the row until you see the first needle begin knitting the yarn. If the carriage jams in the middle of the row, you can also pull down gently on your knitting, which will often free the needles. By jiggling the carriage, you should be able to release the jam as well. Make sure the weighted hem is hanging freely. Don't let your knitting rest or hit your knees. It is better to move your knees than to push the hem behind them, since this can move the needles into a position for creating an occasional jam or cause stitches to drop. Stop every couple rows to pull out several lengths of yarn to keep it free flowing. Even a little tension in the yarn can cause the carriage to feel stuck. And make sure that you've not held the yarn or created any added tension to the yarn as you knitted the last row. It's important to always hold a slack yarn at the start of every row and to let go of it as you knit that row. If you have dropped a stitch, it is easy to fix. Check for the drop stitches, and if you have dropped a stitch, it's easy to pick up. Use the one-prong transfer tool to pick up the drop stitch and put it on the empty needle. Push the needle forward so the stitch goes behind the latch, then pick up the lower ladder and put it on the hook. Knit the stitch through. If you have dropped 2 stitches, do the same for the second ladder and pull the knitting down. If you've made a mistake on the previous row or have knitted too many rows, it's easy to unravel a row. Pull the yarn out sideways and lift it out of the needle hooks and back to the beginning of that row. Be sure to unlatch the last stitch, which is usually a bit tighter than the others. Open the carriage handle and either lift up or remove the key plate. Then you can slide the carriage back to the beginning of the row. Replace the key plate, put the yarn that was ripped out behind the carriage, and you're ready to knit again. To prevent the knitting from curling, secure the sides with the elastic bands and S-hooks provided. If you have animals or small children in the house, it might be a good idea to have your sweater machine set up in a separate room that you can close when you're not using it. Don't forget, if you have any questions about your knitting, or if you have any problems, you can always call our knitting helpline. One of the things I love about the Ultimate Sweater Machine is how quickly you could work into advanced stitches and techniques. I'll show you step by step how to do some basic stitches, as well as some more advanced stitches that will enable you to make gorgeous items like these. But it is important to learn the basics first, and with a little practice, you'll be able to move on to the advanced stitches and even begin creating your own designs. Increasing and decreasing are basic stitches that you'll need to know when you want to make a project that has shaping in it or an angle, such as this sweater sleeve. To increase a stitch at the beginning of the row, bring forward one needle to working position. Check to make sure the latch is open and knit the row. You have increased one stitch. Let's see that again. Bring the needle forward to working position, open the latch, and knit the row. You have now increased your row by 2 stitches. In order to see the angle, I'm going to do 2 more rows. Now let me show you how to decrease a stitch. Using the butt of the needle, bring the needle forward to holding position using the one-prong transfer tool. Insert the eye of the tool into the hook of the needle. Keep the transfer tool horizontal to the floor. Push the needle back until the stitch transfers from the needle onto the transfer tool. Now insert the eye of the transfer tool into the hook of the adjacent needle and lift up on the transfer tool to transfer the stitch to that needle. Push the empty needle to non-working position. Then knit 2 more rows. Once you've knitted your desired length, you're going to need to know how to remove your knitting from the machine. There are 2 techniques for doing this. One is called a chain stitch bind off, and the other one is called a back stitch bind off. After that, I'm also going to show you another way to do an edge to cast on with, called the closed edge or E-wrap cast on. To bind off using the chain stitch, transfer the end stitch to the adjacent needle. This is the same as decreasing a stitch. Bring the needle forward so the stitch goes behind the open latch and lay the yarn into the hook of the needle. Holding the butt of the needle, pull the needle back so the 2 stitches knit together, forming 1 stitch. Continue this way across the row. Since this is a very non-elastic bind off, be sure to keep your binding off loose by pulling the needle all the way back to the bed as you knit the stitches together. As you remove the bound off stitches from the needle, the weighted hem will start to hang on a diagonal. To keep it level, hook the beginning of the cast off edge onto a couple of the empty needles at the beginning of the row. On the last stitch, cut the yarn, leaving a 5 or 6 inch length, and pull that in through the last stitch. Carefully remove the knitting from the machine. You have just completed a bind off using the chain stitch. The second method of binding off is called back stitch. Measure a length of yarn at least 3 times the width of your knitting and cut it. Thread it through a darning needle. A darning needle can be purchased at any craft, fabric, or yarn shop that sells yarn. It's important to keep that in mind, that the best looking edge is created by working the bind off from left to right. Insert the needle into the second stitch, bringing it back through the first stitch. Pull the yarn through the third stitch and back through the second stitch. Work this way all across the row. When you reach the last stitch, pull the yarn through and fasten it off. Remove the knitting by pulling the needles forward to holding position. Then, push the needles back to non-working position. Bring the needle to holding position using the green cards. Make a slip knot at the end of the yarn and loop it over the far left-hand needle. Now, loosely E-wrap the needles across, winding the yarn around counterclockwise to form that E. When you're finished wrapping the needles, bring the yarn through the carriage and push the carriage to the far right. Now, hang the hem as described earlier in the setup of the machine. Make sure the latches are open. Insert the elastic thread and attach the clips at the end of the yarn. Fold the hem over the elastic thread and push the hem back against the needle bed. Remove the green cards and insert the yellow card, pushing the needles back against the yellow card. You'll need to push your carriage slowly for the first row. Remember to hold the yarn at the beginning of the row as usual. You may need to hold the hem back for the first row using your other hand. Now I'd like to show you how to do ribbing. Ribbing is often used for the edges of a sweater to keep it elastic. You would often use the same number of needles that you would for the body of the sweater. While you are used to seeing ribbing on the bottom of a sweater, and for hand knitters, you start with ribbing, for the Ultimate Sweater Machine, you'll be knitting the ribbing after you knit the body of the sweater. The instructions for the sweaters in your Ultimate Pattern book use this method. When you knit a sweater, you will need some waste yarn that's used as a stitch holder, and as any spare yarn you have around the house that knits on the same key plate as your main yarn. It's used as a stitch holder when you remove the work from the needle bed. We have knitted 6 rows of waste yarn and then have finished the back of the sweater. For this sweater, bring the same number of needles forward to holding position that you used for the body of the sweater, -1. With your green cards in place and using your 1-prong tool, pick up the stitches of the main color where it joins with the waste yarn. After you have picked up the first couple stitches, on the opposite end, pick up 2 more to balance the hem. Now, knit the number of rows you want to have for the ribbing on your sweater, ending with a carriage on the left. There are many different types of ribbing, but for this sample, we will be using a 2x1 ribbing or a 2-knit, 1-purl. Insert the latch tool in the first row of ribbing in the 3rd stitch in from the end. Release the corresponding stitch on the needle above by bringing the needle forward to holding position, then back to non-working position. Unravel the stitch to the latch tool and relatch it up. This creates a knit stitch, the reverse of a purl stitch. Skip the next 2 stitches and repeat by inserting the latch tool, releasing the stitch, unraveling it to the latch tool and latching it back up. When you are first learning to do ribbing, it may seem very time-consuming, but once you get used to it, the ribbing can go quite quickly. To finish the edge of the ribbing, use the backstitch bind-off we reviewed earlier. Remove your work from the machine and remove the hem by pulling it away from the waste yarn and snipping the elastic thread. Then unravel your waste yarn. The ribbing knitted on the Ultimate Sweater machine is very even and very elastic. This stitch is called a lace or eyelet stitch. It looks pretty complicated, but it's actually very easy to do. But as most things, you do need to take some practice to learn how to master them properly. Transfer the first stitch to the adjacent needle, just as you did for the decrease. Bring the empty needle forward into holding position and knit 1 row. Push the needle back to forward working position, making sure the latch is open. Knit 1 row. That makes an eyelet, and many eyelets make a lace pattern. This also can make a buttonhole. Let me show you what 3 eyelet stitches look like. Transfer the stitch to the adjacent needle. Bring the empty needle forward into holding position and knit 1 row. Push the needle back to forward working position, making sure the latch is open, and knit 1 row. Now you can see how you create a lace or eyelet pattern. Fair Isle is a technique that's used in this design on the knitted purse. It's also used in the sweater that I have on. It's a technique for combining more than 1 color on a row for a very special look. It's very easy to do on the sweater machine and it's very impressive. To set up your Ultimate Sweater machine for Fair Isle, push the needles where you would like to have the contrasting color into holding position. Always knit the main color, or the color with the greatest number of stitches across the row first, by pushing the carriage slowly across the row. You will then knit the contrast color manually. Make sure these stitches are the same size as the rest of your knitting. Do not pull the stitches too tightly or leave big loops. Just make the stitches the same size as the stitches knitted by the carriage. When you finish the first row, select the needles for the contrast color of the second pattern row. Knit across with the main color in the carriage, then manually knit in the contrast color across the row. Be sure as you lay the yarn into the latch that the latch is open. The spacing of the needles automatically keeps the float, which is the long strand of yarn between the manually knitted stitches, at the right tension. This is how the back looks, with the contrasting floats carried between the pattern stitches. And this is the right side. One of the most popular stitches in knitting today is the cable stitch. It's often used in Irish sweaters and Afghans. To do the cable stitch, you will need both one-prong tools. We will be referring to the stitches of the 6-stitch cable as stitches 1 through 6, numbered left to right. Transfer stitches 1, 2, and 3, one by one, onto one of the one-prong tools by inserting the eye of the transfer tool into the hook of the needle. Be sure to keep your transfer tool angled slightly up so you don't lose the stitches. Then, with the same tool, move the needle forward to holding position, then back to non-working position. Then, hook the eye of the transfer tool onto the left hand adjacent needle and let it go. Using the second transfer tool, remove stitch number 4 and transfer it to needle number 1. Then, transfer stitch number 5 onto needle number 2. And stitch number 6 onto needle number 3. Your stitches will be tight, but that's normal. Now remove the first transfer tool from the needle it is resting on. Using the second one-prong tool, push the first stitch on the transfer tool onto needle number 6. Repeat this for the next 2 stitches, placing them onto needles number 5 and 4. These stitches will also be tight, but again, this is normal for cable. Now bring all the needles holding the cable stitches, plus a couple needles on either side, up to forward working position. This makes knitting the tight stitches easier and is very important. Make sure the latches are open on the needles in forward working position and knit the row. Now knit 9 more rows and repeat making the cable. To make the purl or definition stitch on each side of the cable, insert the latch tool into the first row of the stitch adjacent to the cable. Release the stitch and let it unravel to the latch tool. Latch up the stitch as you would for doing ribbing. Repeat this for the stitch on the other side of the cable. Note that you will want to drop and latch up this stitch approximately every 20 rows, or you'll have to be latching it up from the floor. Now let's see what the cable looks like on the right side. One of the most interesting and creative stitches to do is called intarsia or picture knitting. It can be very simple, like this baby blanket, or it can be very involved, like this sweater. The ultimate sweater machine was designed to do intarsia very easily, on the fly, as you knit. The carriage is specially designed for easy access to the front, or the nose of the carriage. The yarn guide is this round opening at the end of the V. For regular knitting, the yarn is brought up through the yarn guide and through the carriage handle, with the yarn stored on the table behind the needle bed. For intarsia technique, the yarn is normally placed on the floor in front of you. Bring the yarn for the first color up through the yarn guide in the carriage. Knit until you want to change for the second color. Take the first color out of the carriage and thread through the second color and knit the rest of the row. Attach a clip to the yarn of the first color and knit until you want to change back to the first color. When you're ready to change colors, just remove the second color from the carriage and bring the first color up under the second, which locks the yarns together and prevents a hole from forming. Continue creating your desired pattern until you've reached the end of the row. For most intarsia designs, you will be following a printed chart. However, you can also make up a geometric pattern as you go, designing on the fly. You can use as many colors as you like in your designs. When you first start, try to limit your colors to no more than 5 across a row. And now you're ready to create some of your own knitted designer creations. But be sure to look at the pattern book and follow the patterns in there from the beginning until the end, because you'll learn a lot of techniques all through the book. Also, you may need to look at the video more than once, especially if you go into the advanced techniques. And don't forget, you can always call our knitting helpline if you get stuck.